The night the South trembled began like any other, thick with heat, swollen with the hum of cicadas and drenched in the smell of sweat and sugar cane. But in the heart of Fairmont Plantation, beneath the same stars that watched the enslaved die and the masters feast, Josiah was sharpening a blade meant to change history. They said his hands were made for labor, but that night they were made for judgment. The moonlight caught the edge of his knife like a silent sermon. Around him, 20 other men stood barefoot in the dirt, their faces painted with ash from the fields, their eyes burning with a hunger older than America itself. They called him Brother Josiah now, not slave, not servant, and he stood taller than the white mansion that loomed behind the trees, glowing faintly like a ghost in the distance. No one spoke, no one prayed. They had done enough praying. At the stroke of midnight, the dogs stopped barking. The night wind carried a strange peace, the kind that comes before something terrible or holy. Josiah raised his hand, and the world seemed to hold its breath. It was then that Clara Fairmont, the master's only daughter, opened her window and saw him through the magnolia branches. The man she had been forbidden to love, the one her father had beaten for looking too long into her eyes. For weeks she had left small pieces of bread and folded notes in the garden, warning him of her father's plans, of the slave catchers sent to break him. She knew this night would come, but not like this. Not with blood in the air and vengeance in his shadow. The mansion door burst open. Colonel Edwin Fairmont, tall and proud as the empire he thought he ruled, stepped out with a lantern in hand and a pistol at his hip. "Who's there?" he barked. And in the silence that followed, Josiah answered with a voice that shook like thunder. "The man you bought, Colonel. The one you thought God forgot. The first shot missed. The second didn't." When the smoke cleared, the colonel lay face up in the dirt, the lantern rolling beside him, his throat marked with the same blade he had once used to brand others. The fire began soon after. A torch to the cotton fields, a torch to the stables, a torch to the lie of ownership itself. The sky turned red, and the world as Clara knew it began to burn. Josiah didn't flee. He walked through the flames as though baptized in them, his bare feet leaving prints of ash behind. The others followed, setting the chains alight, opening the barns, cutting ropes, freeing men who had forgotten the shape of their own names. For one brief, impossible night, freedom roared louder than the hounds, but amid the chaos he found Clara. She had not run. She stood on the porch, her white nightdress glimmering like a ghost in the smoke, her face streaked with tears and soot. "You killed him," she whispered. "He killed me long before tonight," Josiah said. "I just returned the favor." She looked at him, trembling, and for the first time she didn't see a slave or a savior, just a man caught between heaven and hell, and in that terrible, beautiful moment, she stepped off the porch and into his arms. The two vanished before sunrise, their figures swallowed by the swamps that bordered the plantation, the same swamps that swallowed the bodies, the evidence, the sin. When the sun rose over Georgia, the Fairmont estate was nothing but smoke and rumor. By the week's end, bounty posters with Josiah's name littered the South. Some said he had fled north, others swore he'd died in the fires he started. But whispers spread through the fields and the churches, whispers of a man who had slain his master and married his master's daughter. To the white men he was a demon, to the enslaved he was deliverance, to Clara he was both. And though history would try to bury his name under the ashes of that night, the land itself remembered. Every rustle of cane in the wind, every flicker of lightning over the Georgia sky carried a single echo, the cry of the man who dared to love his enemy's daughter and burn the world that enslaved him. His name was Josiah, and he was the South's first and most feared revolutionary. The night Fairmont Plantation burned, the air itself seemed alive, heavy, breathing, and waiting. There are moments in history when silence screams, when the earth feels like it knows what's coming. That night in July of 1848, the soil of Georgia trembled with the footsteps of men who had finally stopped praying for mercy and started preparing for war. Fairmont was one of the largest plantations in the state, 3,000 acres of cotton, sugarcane, and misery. Its master, Colonel Edwin Fairmont, ruled with a whip in one hand and the Bible in the other. His slaves whispered that he was not a man but a curse passed down from one generation of devils to the next. He believed himself untouchable, until the night his own fields became his gallows. And at the heart of it all stood Josiah, He was not born to lead. The South did not allow such things. He was born into chains, branded before he could speak his own name. But pain, when repeated long enough, becomes prophecy, and Josiah had endured enough pain to fill 100 men's lives. He had been whipped until his skin looked like firewood, starved until his ribs played melody with the wind, and forced to kneel until the bones in his knees hardened like stone. Yet his eyes never bowed. They said he could read, secretly taught by an abolitionist preacher who once passed through under the guise of a cotton merchant. The master never knew, but those who worked the fields saw Josiah whispering verses from a torn page of Exodus. "Let my people go." Those 4 words became his prayer, his poison, and his plan. As the sun died that evening, Fairmont's house glowed with laughter. Inside, the colonel and his guests drank imported brandy, toasting the season's harvest. Outside, beneath the slave quarters, 20 men gathered in the shadows. Josiah's voice was low, rough, deliberate, the kind of voice born from pain, tempered by purpose. Tonight, he said, we stop asking to be men. We become them. The men around him nodded. They had sharpened scythes, hidden knives, even carved weapons from the bones of oxen. Some trembled, others smiled through tears. Behind them, the women waited with children pressed to their skirts, watching the dark horizon where their futures slept. Josiah looked toward the mansion, its white columns gleaming in moonlight, a symbol of everything stolen. He could still remember being dragged across its porch as a boy, the colonel laughing as his mother begged. She had been sold to another state before dawn. That porch, that laughter, that night, it had never left him. Now he would make sure it never left the colonel either. At midnight, the first torch was lit. It was small at first, a flicker trembling in the humid wind. But 1 torch became 2, then 10, until the field itself glowed like sunrise. The flames licked the cotton rows, swallowing the wealth that had been built on backs and blood. Horses screamed, dogs howled, the overseer stumbled from his quarters, shouting for order, but his voice was swallowed by the sound of something larger. Freedom, roaring like thunder. The slaves did not run, they advanced. Josiah walked straight toward the mansion. The white steps of the veranda shone like bone. He could see the colonel inside, stumbling from the parlor with a pistol in one hand and a decanter in the other. The man's face turned ghostly pale as he saw the figure in the doorway. Bare-chested, covered in soot, eyes glowing red from the firelight. "Boy," the colonel stammered, raising his gun. "You forget who you are." Josiah's voice came back steady as a blade. "No, Colonel, I just remembered." The pistol fired, once, then twice. 1 shot grazed Josiah's shoulder, spinning him slightly. The other missed. In the next breath, the master's weapon was knocked aside, his wrist crushed beneath Josiah's hand. The 2 men struggled across the floor, master and slave, hunter and hunted, until the blade found its mark. The colonel's blood hit the floorboards like rain on dry earth. Josiah didn't look away. He held the dying man's gaze and whispered, "This is for every man who prayed and was never heard." Then he let him fall. Outside, the night exploded. The other slaves stormed the barns, breaking locks, cutting the bridles from the horses, tearing open grain sacks to feed the hungry. Chains were thrown into the fire, the sound of metal shrieking louder than the cries of any master. The house began to burn from within, curtains catching first, then the floorboards, then the roof. Josiah stepped out onto the porch, the flames lighting his skin like a vision from the book of Exodus itself. Around him, the men cheered, and for the first time in his life, he smiled. But even amid the smoke, one figure caught his eye. Clara Fairmont, standing at the top of the hill, her white gown bright against the dark. She had come from her room when the gunshots rang out, her heart torn between fear and love. She saw him through the fire, and though she said nothing, her tears gleamed like glass. For a single moment, the world fell quiet, the fire crackling, the air shimmering between them. Then she turned and fled into the darkness, and Josiah knew his freedom would cost more than blood. By dawn, Fairmont Plantation was gone. The colonel's body lay unrecognizable in the ashes. The great house collapsed into itself like a dying beast. Smoke rolled across the fields, carrying the scent of vengeance. From Savannah to Macon, white men would speak his name like a curse. But to those who had lived beneath the whip, Josiah became something else, not a man, but a prophecy fulfilled. And when the first light of morning broke through the haze, the men who stood beside him swore that they saw something written in the smoke. A shadow, a sign, a reminder. It looked like a hand reaching toward the sky. That day, the South learned fear, because one of its own slaves had shown it that even a man born in chains can set the world on fire. They said that when Colonel Edwin Fairmont died, the wind in Georgia stopped blowing for 3 days. The air turned thick as smoke, and the crows vanished from the trees. It was as if even nature wanted to forget the sound of his name. For 30 years, the colonel had ruled Fairmont Plantation like a kingdom carved from cruelty. He had no sons, only acres, slaves, and scars. To his mind, pain was a language, and every lash was a sentence written on the backs of the broken. He had built his fortune on fear, and fear had served him faithfully, until the night Josiah learned that fear could be turned against its master. That night the moon was swollen and red. The mansion windows glowed with music and laughter as guests toasted the harvest. Down in the slave quarters, men whispered Josiah's name like a prayer and a warning. They said he had been seen in the barn sharpening the blade of a cane knife until it sang. They said his eyes had changed, darker, quieter, full of something dangerous and holy. By midnight, the plantation had begun to breathe like a living thing, every door creaking, every ember glowing, every heart waiting for the moment when life would tilt toward fire. Inside the great house, Colonel Fairmont was drunk on brandy and pride. His boots were polished, his vest gold-trimmed, and his laughter loud enough to drown the faint crackle of flames starting in the distance. He was telling the story of how he once whipped a runaway so badly that even the dogs refused to touch the body. The guests laughed uneasily, because that was what one did in the South, laugh at cruelty and call it order. Then came the knock. It was faint, deliberate, not the sound of fear, but of decision. The butler went to the door, but before he could open it, the hinges gave way with a thunderous crash. A burst of smoke rolled in, and from the haze stepped Josiah. His chest was bare, his arms streaked with soot and sweat. Behind him, the glow of burning cotton fields turned the night into blood. Every glass in the room froze midair. Every man reached for his pistol. Every woman gasped. The colonel rose slowly, disbelief twisting his face. "You dare step into my house, boy," he growled. Josiah took one step closer. "It ain't your house no more." The words hung in the air like gunpowder. Fairmont snatched the pistol from his belt, his hand shaking with rage. "You've forgotten your place." Josiah's reply was quiet, almost tender. "No, sir, I just found it." The gun fired, a bright flash in the smoke. The bullet tore through Josiah's arm, spinning him backward. But pain didn't stop him. It seemed to crown him. He lunged forward, the cane knife flashing once, twice, and then the pistol clattered to the floor. The colonel stumbled, eyes wide, blood blooming through his vest like a spreading rose. You're nothing but—" The rest never came. Josiah caught him by the collar and dragged him through the parlor, through the hallway lined with portraits of dead men who had lived by the same cruelty. He kicked open the back door, and the two of them stumbled into the yard, into the full blaze of the uprising. Slaves were shouting, fires roared. The air was alive with screams and freedom. Josiah threw the colonel against the very post where he had once been tied and beaten as a boy. The irony was not lost on him. "You remember this place?" Josiah asked, his voice steady now. "You called it the whipping tree." The colonel spat blood, glaring with hate. "You'll hang for this." Josiah smiled, not cruelly, but with something like peace. "Maybe, but first you'll know how it feels." He lifted the whip from the hook on the post. It was the same one the colonel had used countless times. Thick, oiled, familiar. Josiah ran his fingers along the leather, as if greeting an old friend. Then he brought it down once, hard, across the man's back. The sound echoed through the yard, not like pain, but like justice returning home. Again and again. The lash cracked, the colonel screamed, and for every cry Josiah saw the face of someone who had suffered, his mother, his brother, the children buried in the fields. When it was done, he dropped the whip and reached for the noose hanging from the barn beam. the same rope that had taken the lives of those who dared to run. He looped it around the colonel's neck and hoisted him high until the man's boots kicked at the air, until the world went still, and there he hung, the master of Fairmont, swaying against the firelight, his shadow dancing across the barn he had ruled, the slaves gathered below, their faces lit by the flames. Some wept, some prayed, none spoke. They had seen men die before, but never like this, never with righteousness burning brighter than the torches. When Josiah stepped away, the fire reflected in his eyes like a crown. He didn't look triumphant. He looked hollow, emptied by what he'd done. Freedom had come, but it had come at a cost too high for joy. Clara appeared in the doorway, her face pale, her hands trembling. Her gaze shifted from her father's lifeless body to Josiah's bloodied hands. Something between horror and understanding flickered in her eyes. "You killed him," she whispered. Josiah looked up at her, his voice raw. "He killed everything long before tonight." They stared at each other, two souls standing on opposite sides of the same ruin. The house crackled behind them, beams collapsing, windows shattering under the heat. The air smelled of smoke, sweat, and redemption. When dawn came, the plantation was nothing but ashes. The colonel's body still hung in the ruins, a warning to some and a monument to others. In the nearby town, people would whisper of the slave who had hanged his master like a thief. They would curse his name, call him a monster, a murderer, a demon. But among the freedmen, Josiah's story spread like wildfire through the fields and shanty towns, not as horror but as hope. They called him Josiah the Revolutionary, the man who had done what others only dreamed. And in the hearts of those who still lived in bondage, a dangerous thought began to bloom. If Josiah could rise, then maybe so could they. They said love was a sin that burned hotter than fire, and for Josiah and Clara Fairmont, that sin became the most dangerous kind of salvation. After the revolt, after the smoke of the plantation rose into the dawn like a prayer denied, the world as they knew it had split in two. One part burned with justice, the other with guilt, and in between stood Clara, the daughter of the man Josiah had killed, standing in the ruins of her father's empire, looking into the eyes of the man who had set her free and damned her soul all in the same breath. No one in Georgia could have imagined what followed. Clara had been raised on obedience and lace, on Southern charm polished over cruelty, on hymns sung to hide the sound of the whip. Her father had taught her that slaves were less than human, that their purpose was to serve. But Josiah had shattered that illusion long before he raised a hand against her father. It began years before the fire. Clara had seen him first in the cotton fields, his back gleaming with sweat under the cruel sun, his movements steady, controlled, proud. There was something in the way he carried himself, as if even the chains could not convince him he belonged to anyone. She was 16 then, curious and reckless, always sneaking beyond her lessons, always looking at the world her father told her to ignore. Once she had found him by the river, washing blood from his hands after a whipping. Their eyes met, and for a moment, neither looked away. She had offered him water, trembling, terrified, and he had refused, not out of pride but to protect her, because even then he understood that kindness from a white woman could get a black man killed faster than rebellion. But that one moment lingered. For years afterward, Clara found herself drawn to him, to the silence in his eyes, to the strength in his restraint, and Josiah, though he fought it, could not stop himself from watching her from afar, from wondering how the daughter of a monster could have eyes that looked at him without disgust. The night her father died, the barrier between them broke. After the fire, after the screams and the chaos, Josiah found her alone in her father's study, clutching a pistol she did not know how to use. Her white gown was streaked with soot, her hair undone, her face hollow from shock. When he stepped into the room, she raised the gun, but her hand shook too hard to aim. "Kill me," she whispered, her voice raw. "You've taken everything else." Josiah took another step forward. "You don't know what you're saying." Tears streaked down her cheeks. "You murdered my father." "He murdered mine too," Josiah said quietly, "just not with a bullet." The pistol fell from her hand. She sank to the floor, sobbing, her body trembling with confusion and grief. Josiah knelt beside her, not touching her, not daring. For a long while there was only silence, the crackle of distant fire and the sound of two broken worlds trying to breathe the same air. It should have ended there. But fate, like the South, has a cruel sense of humor. In the days that followed, Clara refused to leave. The other white families fled to nearby towns, but she stayed in the ashes of Fairmont House, claiming she had nowhere else to go. The slaves, now free, wanted her gone, but Josiah forbade anyone from harming her. "Let her decide what she'll become," he said. "The Lord's punishment ain't mine to give." Each night she brought him bandages, wrapped his wounds, and listened as he spoke of freedom, not vengeance, but the right to breathe, to build, to live without chains. She had never heard words like his before, and though her heart rebelled against him, her soul began to understand. He told her of his mother, sold when he was a child, of his brother whipped to death for stealing bread, of the day he stopped believing in God because God seemed to only speak in the voices of white men, and she, in turn, told him of her own prison, the gilded kind, of a father who ruled her life with the same iron he used on others, of a childhood filled with silence and obedience, never love. Somewhere in that strange confession, hatred gave way to something else, fragile, forbidden, alive. It was on the third night, when the fire had turned to embers, that it happened. She found him sitting on the porch, the moonlight soft against his scars. He looked up as she approached, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. "You should hate me," she said quietly. "I did," he answered, "until I saw you cry." Then she reached out, slow, trembling, and touched his face. Her fingers traced the line of his jaw, the cut on his cheek, the burn marks that would never fade. And Josiah, who had spent a lifetime being treated as less than human, felt something he had never known before, to be seen as a man. They kissed, not gently but desperately, like two people drowning in the same storm. The world outside didn't matter then. Not the blood, not the laws, not the judgment waiting beyond those ashes. For a brief, impossible moment, they were not master's daughter and slave, not white and black, not sinner and saint. They were just two souls who had been broken by the same man and found something sacred in the ruin he left behind. But the world does not forgive what it cannot understand. Rumors spread quickly that the colonel's daughter had taken to sharing a roof with his killer, that she was protecting him, that she had gone mad. By the week's end, bounty hunters were already coming through the woods, following the whispers. One night, Josiah woke to find Clara gone. Panic seized him until he saw her riding back through the rain, her gown drenched, her eyes fierce. She had gone into town and sold her jewelry, bribed a preacher, and forged a paper. It read, "Marriage license, 1848, Josiah Turner and Clara Fairmont." He stared at it, stunned. "Clara, this could get you killed." She smiled through her tears. "Then we'll die as equals." And in the ruin of her father's chapel, beneath a cross that had watched over years of cruelty, they spoke vows no one else would hear, vows that would haunt Georgia for generations. When they sealed it with a kiss, thunder rolled across the sky. It was as if heaven itself had gasped, and hell had started taking notes. That night, the South gained a legend: the white woman who married her father's slave, and the man who made her believe that freedom was worth any sin. The morning Josiah and Clara married, the sky hung low and gray, as though even heaven hesitated to witness what was about to happen. It was August 12, 1848, and the ruins of Fairmont Plantation still smoked in the distance. The ashes had cooled, but the hatred in Georgia had not. The colonel's death had spread across the South like wildfire. His killer had been named a devil, and his daughter, the traitor who loved him, had become the shame of every white household from Savannah to Charleston. Yet somewhere beyond the marshes, hidden among cypress and moss, a chapel still stood. It had once belonged to a Confederate officer who fled after the uprising. Now it was nothing but rot and ruin, the pews warped, the altar covered in dust, the Bible half burned from a lightning strike. But to Josiah and Clara, it was more sacred than any cathedral in the land. That was where they went, through the swamp, through the whispering dark, until they reached the door carved with a single word: faith. They entered like fugitives from two worlds. Clara wore a simple gray dress, torn at the hem, her golden hair tied back with a ribbon once white, now stained by ash. Josiah wore the coat of his dead master, not as mockery but as defiance, a symbol that no man would ever own him again. The preacher who awaited them was an old freedman named Ezekiel, a man whose face looked carved from centuries of sorrow. He had baptized slaves in secret rivers, married couples in barns by candlelight, and buried the fallen in unmarked graves. His voice was cracked but powerful, the kind that carried both grief and God in the same breath. When they stood before him, he did not ask for names or for permission. He only looked at them long, then said quietly, "You both know what this means." Clara nodded. "We do." Ezekiel's gaze lingered on her, pale skin, trembling hands, blue eyes filled with something both reckless and divine. "Child," he said softly, "this world ain't ready for love like yours." "Then we'll teach it," she replied. Josiah reached for her hand. His fingers, rough from labor and scars, swallowed hers like iron meeting silk. For a moment, neither moved. They stood in silence, the wind moaning through the broken chapel, the smell of wet earth and cypress drifting in. Ezekiel began to speak. "In the eyes of heaven there is neither bond nor free, neither black nor white, neither master nor slave, only man and woman, made from the same dust." The words hung heavy, trembling between the cracks of the old wood. When Josiah repeated his vows, his voice shook, not from fear, but from the weight of what it meant. "I take you, Clara Fairmont, not as my master's daughter, not as a white woman, but as my equal before God. I will protect you till my last breath, though the world call me cursed." Clara's tears fell freely as she spoke in turn. "I take you, Josiah Turner, not as my father's slave, but as my husband. If they call me fallen, let me fall. If they call me mad, let me be mad. I would rather walk beside you in exile than sit alone in a house built on chains." When Ezekiel placed his trembling hands upon theirs, the rain began, slow at first, then fierce, as though the sky itself were weeping. "Then by the law of heaven," he said, "and not the law of men, I declare you one." Their lips met beneath the leaking roof, rain mingling with tears, thunder shaking the rafters. Somewhere outside a hawk screamed, a sound both mournful and triumphant. And just like that, a revolution took flesh. For a few days they lived like ghosts in the swamps, free but hunted, married but exiled. They built a small cabin from broken planks and wild hope. Clara learned to cook over a fire, to wash in river water, to live without mirrors or maids. Her skin darkened beneath the sun and her hands grew calloused, yet she said she had never felt more alive. Each night she and Josiah would sit beneath the stars, their fingers entwined, whispering dreams they dared not speak in daylight. They talked of building a community, a place where no color defined a man's worth, where love did not bow to fear. Josiah called it New Eden, though he knew the serpent was already watching, because word had spread. Every town crier in Georgia spoke of them now. The white woman and her father's killer. The newspapers called her the fallen angel of Fairmont, and him the beast who bewitched her. The governor himself put out a bounty, $2,000 for Josiah, dead or alive, and the woman unharmed to be brought back for questioning. But Clara refused to hide in silence. When riders passed near their camp, she would step out and stare them down, unarmed, unafraid. Some spat at her, some wept, some simply rode away, because no one in the South knew what to do with a woman who loved her enemy. One evening, as the sun bled into the marsh, Josiah asked her quietly, "If they catch me, what will you do?" She looked at him, her voice steady. "Then they'll have to hang me too." He smiled sadly. "You were born for silk, Clara, not rope." She stepped closer, her hand on his chest. "Silk binds softer but tighter. I choose the rope, so long as it's tied to you." Days turned into weeks, and the swamp began to feel like home. Ezekiel returned once, bringing word from freedmen across Georgia, men and women who had heard of Josiah's revolt and now called him a deliverer. They sent messages hidden in quilts and hymn lyrics, promising to join him soon. But not everyone who came to the swamp came in peace. On a moonless night, as Clara slept against his chest, Josiah heard the sound of hooves in the distance. He rose, listening, 3 riders, maybe 4. The bounty hunters had come. He kissed her forehead gently and whispered, "If I don't come back, you keep running." She woke, clutching his arm. "No, Josiah, not this time. We face them together." He hesitated, but saw in her eyes that she meant it. that the same fire that had burned the plantation now burned in her blood. When the riders broke through the trees, torches in hand, Josiah stepped out to meet them, his hand tight around the blade that had once ended a master's life. Beside him, Clara stood barefoot in her gray dress, her hair whipping in the wind. The bounty leader spat. "You think she'll still love you when she sees you hang?" Josiah's grip tightened. "She already knows what hanging feels like," he said. "She's been tied to your kind her whole life." Then the first shot fired. By dawn, the ground was wet with blood, but not theirs. The swamp kept their secret. The legend spread faster. By the time the next sun rose, Georgia was whispering of the interracial marriage that defied hell itself, a love that broke every chain, and two souls who proved that freedom once found can never be owned again. And far beyond those marshes, in towns that dared not speak her name aloud, white women began to hum the name Clara Fairmont, quietly, fearfully, hopefully, because if she could love the man her world taught her to hate, maybe there was still a God watching after all. The South does not forgive. And in the summer of 1849, the wind that swept through Georgia carried more than dust and cotton. It carried Josiah Turner's name, whispered like a curse. Every tavern, every stable, every church pew held the same story. The runaway slave who killed his master burned a plantation and stole the hand of a white woman. But worse, he married her. For men like Sheriff Hal McCready, that was not merely a crime, it was an abomination. McCready had once been Colonel Fairmont's overseer before the uprising. Brutal, loyal, and proud of both. When the colonel died at the hands of the man he had once whipped, McCready swore vengeance. He gathered a band of men, ex-soldiers, bounty riders, and drunks too mean for mercy, and set out to hunt Josiah down. They called themselves the Night Riders of Redemption, though redemption was the one thing they'd never bring. Their reward, $2,000 and Clara Fairmont alive. For weeks they rode through the backwoods of Georgia, following whispers like bloodhounds. Every freedman they caught, they beat for answers. Every cabin they passed, they searched. They even ransacked a black church in Savannah, tearing open hymn books and dragging the preacher into the yard when he refused to speak Josiah's name. McCready carried with him the colonel's old pistol, a silver-handled flintlock engraved with E.F. "I'll kill the bastard with his own master's gun," he'd say, and his men would laugh, though none of them liked the look in his eyes. It wasn't justice he was after, it was legacy. Meanwhile, Josiah and Clara lived like ghosts in the swamps of Cumberland Island, a stretch of green hell where the air hung thick and the ground swallowed sound. They built a home of driftwood and iron nails stolen from an abandoned dock. The freedmen called the place the Hollow, and slowly, one by one, others came. Runaways, escaped servants, black preachers, even a few white farmers too poor to own anyone but themselves. Clara taught the children how to read. Josiah trained the men to fight. Their nights were filled with hymns and hammer blows, their mornings with hope. But peace in the South never lasts. One evening, Ezekiel came to their camp, his mule limping, his coat soaked with rain. He looked older than before, eyes haunted, voice trembling. "They come in, Josiah," he said. "McCready and his riders burned a settlement near Darien looking for you." Josiah set down the hammer he was holding. "How long?" 2, maybe 3 days. Less, if the river don't rise." Clara stepped forward. "Then we'll leave. We can go north, cross the border." Josiah shook his head. "Every time we run, they'll follow. Every time they find us, they'll burn what we build. There ain't no north strong enough to hide from hate." Ezekiel nodded slowly. "Then you best make a stand, son." That night, Josiah called his people together. Men, women, and children gathered around the fire, eyes wide with fear. He told them the truth, that the bounty hunters were coming, that they'd kill every man and take every woman. But then he said something that made the fear melt into fire. "They say we can't be free, that the color of our skin means God don't listen, but tonight we prove he does. Tonight we show 'em we ain't slaves no more, we're soldiers." A murmur rippled through the camp. The men began to sharpen blades, the women packed what food they could, and Clara, her hair tied back, her face streaked with ash, loaded Josiah's musket and said, "Then we fight together." He looked at her for a long moment. "If they take you, they won't," she said. "You made sure of that the day you gave me your name. By dawn, the marshes were quiet, heavy with fog. The bounty hunters came in single file, torches cutting through the mist. Mac Creedy rode at the front, his horse black as coal, the silver pistol gleaming in his hand. When they reached the first clearing, a bell rang out. A church bell, though no one knew where it came from. The sound echoed through the swamp like a warning. Then came the arrows. 2 riders fell before they even saw the enemy. The rest fired wildly into the mist. From the reeds and shadows came the freedmen, shouting, firing, swinging blades carved from scythes and broken tools. Josiah led the charge. He moved like a man who'd been waiting his whole life for this moment. His musket fired once, then his knife took its place. The swamp became a battlefield of ghosts. Torches fell into the water, lighting the mist like candle flame. Horses screamed, men drowned, the air reeked of gunpowder and blood. Mac Creedy roared through the chaos, searching for him. "Show yourself, boy! Face me like a man!" And then he saw him, standing in the shallow water, chest bare, eyes burning through the fog. "Been waitin' for you," Josiah said. Mac Creedy raised the pistol. "You'll die with that Yankee whore." Josiah smiled faintly. "Then I'll die free." The gun fired. The bullet grazed his ribs, but Josiah didn't stop. He lunged forward, slamming the knife into Mac Creedy's side. The 2 men fell into the mud, thrashing, choking, cursing. Mac Creedy's hand clamped around Josiah's throat. Josiah's fist came down once, twice, until the overseer's eyes went glassy. When it was over, the swamp went still. Josiah pulled the silver pistol from Mac Creedy's belt, wiped the blood from it, and stared at the initials, E.F., the mark of his master, now his trophy. Clara found him minutes later, her dress soaked, her face streaked with tears. "It's done?" she whispered. He nodded, for now. Behind them the survivors gathered, battered but alive. They had won, but the victory felt hollow. The swamp had taken as much as it had given. Bodies floated in the reeds. Smoke curled through the mist. Ezekiel knelt beside a fallen boy, whispering a prayer. "Lord, take 'em gentle. They died for the freedom you promised." Josiah stood in silence, his arm around Clara. "We can't stay here," he said finally. "They'll send more." She looked up at him, eyes full of resolve. "Then we build again, somewhere they'll never find us." He smiled faintly, though he knew the truth. The world had already found them. Every mile of the South now echoed their names. Josiah the killer, Clara the traitor. Together they were myth, rebellion, sin, and salvation. And as the dawn rose over the swamp, turning the mist gold and red, Ezekiel spoke the words that would follow them forever. When a man fights for freedom, heaven listens, but when a woman loves him for it, hell takes notice. The Cumberland Island swamp was not a place meant for living things. It stank of salt, rot, and memory. Trees grew out of water instead of soil, their roots tangled like the bones of the dead. The air never cleared. It hung thick, buzzing with flies and the faint hum of mosquitoes. And yet, out of this drowned land, Josiah Turner built something no white man believed could exist, a colony of freedom. The war had not yet come, but the South was already bleeding. Plantations whispered of revolt. Masters slept with guns beside their beds. But on Cumberland, there were no chains, no overseers, no master's whip cracking through the morning mist, only the sound of hammers, prayers, and song. Josiah called it the Free Colony of Cumberland, though the people who came there called it simply the Haven. At first, they numbered barely 20, men and women who had slipped away from fields, shacks, and wagon chains in the night. They arrived barefoot, terrified, carrying children or scars or nothing at all. Josiah greeted each one with the same quiet words, "Ain't no master here, only work, and freedom if you earn it." Clara Fairmont stood beside him, the daughter of the man he'd killed, now his wife, pale as river light in her tattered white dress. She was the one who taught the children letters, using the bark of cypress trees as slates. She would sit with them near the fire and draw letters with burnt sticks, her voice soft and steady. A is for Almighty, B is for blood, C is for courage. Many of the older men couldn't read, but they'd listen anyway, nodding as though her words themselves were a kind of healing. Ezekiel, the old preacher who'd helped Josiah escape, took it upon himself to build a chapel. It was nothing more than driftwood and moss, but when the people gathered there on Sundays it felt like a cathedral. They'd sing until the trees themselves seemed to sway with the rhythm. Ain't no grave gonna hold me down. It was music born of grief, and yet it sounded like victory. By the second year, the colony had grown. They built smokehouses, huts, and a well. Josiah led the hunting parties. Clara managed the medicines. Every man swore loyalty not to a crown or master, but to the laws Josiah wrote by hand. No man shall own another. Every woman is to be treated as equal in labor and spirit. No harm to come to the children of the haven. Any betrayal to the South shall be answered with death. Those laws were carved into an oak plank and hung above the chapel door. To the settlers, it was the closest thing they had to a constitution. But freedom carries a curse. It breeds envy in the eyes of those who cannot imagine it. Word of the colony spread across the Georgia coast. Whispers found their way to Savannah, then Charleston. Some said it was a camp of runaway slaves. Others said it was a gathering of devil worshippers and white harlots. Most called it rebellion. To the South, Josiah Turner was no longer a man. He was a myth, a black Moses leading sinners through the swamp to freedom, and myths in those days were hunted like beasts. Despite the danger, life in the colony found rhythm. Nights were filled with firelight and stories, tales of Africa, of love, of blood. Josiah would sit among them, silent mostly, watching his people eat and laugh, his hand wrapped around Clara's. She had begun to look older, thinner, but her eyes still carried the same fierce glow as the night they fled. Sometimes she'd wake from nightmares, whispering about her father's voice in the dark. Josiah would hold her close and say, "Ain't no ghosts here but the ones we let live." But ghosts never listen. One stormy night, Ezekiel came running from the edge of the camp. "Riders," he gasped. "I seen 'em by the ridge. White coats, rifles, maybe 10 of 'em." The people panicked, but Josiah raised his hand. "No fire, no fear. If they come, we'll be ready." He sent the women and children deep into the mangroves, where even the hounds wouldn't track them. Then he and the men prepared. Traps were laid in the marsh, muskets oiled, blades sharpened. By dawn, the riders came, Confederate scouts sent not to capture but to burn. They found nothing but smoke. The settlers had vanished into the trees, silent as shadows. When the soldiers dismounted, the ground itself betrayed them. Spikes of sharpened cane hidden in the mud, screams echoed through the mist, rifles fired into the void. From the treetops, Josiah's men rained down fury. The swamp became their ally, a living, breathing wall of vengeance. By noon, the soldiers were gone, their bodies fed to the mire. When it was over, Josiah stood beside Clara at the water's edge. "They'll send more," she said softly. "I know," he answered. "That's why we keep building." And they did. For every man lost, 2 came to replace him. For every house burned, 3 more rose from the mud. The free colony became a legend told in whispers across the South. A place where black men lived as kings, where white and black loved without chains, where justice had no color. But legends have a way of attracting enemies, and betrayers. One evening a stranger arrived, a man with soft hands and smooth talk. He said his name was Jonas, that he'd escaped from a plantation in Savannah. He brought news of more fugitives ready to join, and Josiah welcomed him without question. Clara didn't trust him. "His eyes don't flinch," she whispered. "Not like the others." Josiah only smiled. "We don't turn away those who seek freedom." That night, Jonas drank by the fire, laughing, telling stories of the coast. But before dawn, he slipped away into the woods. By the time Josiah discovered his absence, it was too late. Jonas was no runaway. He was a scout for the Confederacy, promised gold for the colony's location. By the next week, the marshes were surrounded. As Josiah looked out across the mist-covered swamp, he knew the peace they had built, the fragile, beautiful thing born from pain, was about to be tested again. He turned to Clara, who stood with the children behind her. "Even if they burn it all," she said, her voice calm, "you've shown them what freedom looks like." Josiah nodded. "Then they'll have to kill every last one of us to take it back." And when the first torch appeared through the fog, reflected in the water like a wound in the world, he lifted his musket and whispered, "Let 'em come. Freedom's got a price, and we've already paid the down payment." It began with silence, not the peaceful kind, the kind that comes before thunder, The free colony of Cumberland lay still that night, its fires smothered, its songs replaced by the restless whisper of wind through the cypress trees. The air felt heavy, like it was waiting to break. Josiah Turner stood on the edge of the swamp, eyes on the moon reflected in the black water. He had learned to read the signs of danger long before he could read a word, the way birds stopped singing, the way even the frogs went quiet. And now the swamp was mute. Clara came to his side, her white shawl ghost-like in the dark. "What is it?" she asked softly. He didn't answer right away. His hand rested on the hilt of the knife at his belt, the same blade that had ended Colonel Fairmont's reign. "Something ain't right," he murmured. "The water's wrong. The air's wrong." He turned back toward camp, toward the huts and the chapel and the small fires burning low, and saw Ezekiel walking toward him, carrying a lantern. The old man's face looked carved out of fear. "They're comin', son," Ezekiel said. "Jonas done it." Josiah froze. "You sure?" Ezekiel nodded, found his trail near the ridge. Boot prints lead straight to the mainland road. "He sold us," Josiah told him where we are. For a long moment, Josiah said nothing. The night seemed to close in around them. Then he exhaled slowly, his voice low but steady. "Wake the men. Send the women and children into the mangroves. We hold the line here." By midnight, the colony was awake and alive with panic. Mothers clutched their children. Men loaded muskets and sharpened blades. Clara moved among them, handing out bandages and whispering prayers under her breath. Josiah climbed onto a stump in the center of camp and spoke loud enough for all to hear. "They think we'll run. They think we'll bow again. But tonight we show 'em the truth. Freedom don't die easy." The people murmured in response, fear mixing with faith. They trusted him, not because he promised safety, but because he promised meaning. Even in death they would die free. Not far beyond the swamp's edge, the sound of horses echoed. Dozens of them. The Confederates were coming, torches glowing through the mist like the eyes of hell itself. Jonas rode at the front beside a captain in gray. His face was pale, his expression hard. The captain tossed him a coin purse. "You did good," the officer said. "Now keep your mouth shut and your distance. Once we've cleared the place, you can have whatever's left." Jonas nodded, but his hands trembled. He told himself he had no choice, that the gold could buy him land, food, maybe even peace. But in his gut, something rotted. He remembered Clara's kindness, Josiah's faith. He remembered the songs by the fire. But gold blinds a man faster than chains ever can. The attack began before dawn. The Confederates came from 3 sides, rifles blazing, dogs howling. The swamp lit up with fire and screams. Bullets tore through the reeds, splintering huts and bodies alike. Josiah's men fought back fiercely, firing from behind trees, from the water, from the shadows. Every torch they extinguished bought them another heartbeat of life. Josiah himself stood in the thick of it, musket in hand, shouting commands over the chaos. "Hold the line! Protect the children!" The smoke grew thick. Men fell. Women screamed. Clara ran between the wounded with her apron soaked in blood, pressing hands to wounds that would not close. At the far edge of the camp, Jonas watched the slaughter unfold. He could see Josiah, tall, defiant, blood-streaked, alive in the firelight. Something inside him broke. The gold in his pocket felt heavy, heavier than sin. He turned his horse and fled into the marsh, unable to watch what he had done, but the swamp doesn't forgive betrayal. As he galloped through the mire, the earth beneath him gave way. The horse stumbled, shrieked, and plunged into the bog. Jonas screamed for help, but none came. The swamp swallowed him slowly, pulling him down inch by inch, until the only thing left above the surface was his hand clutching the coin purse. Before even that disappeared beneath the black water, back in the colony, the battle raged. Josiah fought until his musket jammed, then drew his knife. The Confederates pushed forward, torches high. The chapel burned first, flames licking up the cross Ezekiel had carved by hand. Ezekiel himself was shot in the chest while trying to save a boy. As he fell, he looked to the sky and whispered, "Lord, take me home, but don't let 'em win." Josiah saw it happen, and something inside him snapped. He roared, charging into the line of soldiers like a storm. His knife flashed, his fists struck like hammers. He was no longer fighting for life, he was fighting for legacy. Clara found him moments later, blood on his hands, tears on her cheeks. "We can't win," she gasped. "We already have," he said. "They can kill us, but they can't kill what we built." A gunshot cracked through the smoke. Josiah stumbled, a bullet tearing through his shoulder. Clara screamed, catching him before he fell. The soldiers were closing in, shouting orders. She dragged him toward the mangroves, half carrying, half dragging, until they reached the narrow pass that led deeper into the swamp. Behind them, the colony burned. Every hut, every prayer, every scrap of freedom they had carved from the mud. Josiah looked back once, his breath ragged. "They can take the land," he whispered, "but they can't take the story." And with that, he and Clara vanished into the fog. By the time the sun rose, the Confederate soldiers found nothing but ashes and corpses. No trace of Josiah, no trace of Clara, only the remnants of a colony that had dared to dream beyond chains. The captain spat into the dirt. "Burn it all again," he ordered, "and mark the ground as cursed." But the swamp had already marked itself. For months afterward, soldiers who passed near Cumberland swore they heard voices at night. The sound of singing carried through the mist. Some said it was the wind. Others said it was the souls of the freedmen still guarding their home, and among them they claimed you could hear Josiah's voice, calm, defiant, eternal, whispering through the reeds, "Freedom don't die, it waits." The swamp had turned to smoke. Cumberland was no longer a refuge, it was a graveyard. Trees burned from their roots, huts collapsed into glowing ash, and the once sacred chapel stood as a blackened skeleton, its cross fallen, its bell melted into silence. Through the fog and flame, Josiah Turner stumbled forward, his shoulder bleeding, his breath shallow. Behind him, Clara struggled to keep pace, her white dress streaked with soot and blood. The fire painted her face in ghostly orange hues, half angel, half apparition. They had been running since dawn, chased by Confederate soldiers determined to erase them from history. Each step through the swamp felt heavier, the mud clutching their feet like the hands of the dead. The sound of dogs echoed behind them. Low, hungry growls, closer each minute. Josiah leaned against a tree, clutching his wound. "Go," he gasped. "You can still make it to the river. Take the boat. You'll find safety up north." Clara turned on him fiercely. "I didn't come this far to leave you behind. You'll die if you stay. Then I'll die as your wife," she said, voice trembling but steady. For a moment the world stopped. The fire, the smoke, the screams. It was just the two of them in that cursed swamp, two souls defying a world built on hate. Josiah looked at her, really looked, and saw not the daughter of his master, but the only proof that love could grow in a field watered by blood. Then, in the distance, came the sound of rifles cocking. They reached a clearing, a small patch of dry ground surrounded by water and flame. The rest of their people had either fled or fallen. Only a handful remained. Ezekiel's nephew Thomas, a boy of barely 17, clutching a rusted pistol, old Mercy, who still carried her dead daughter's rosary, and two others, their faces painted with ash and desperation. Josiah raised his musket. "This is where we make our stand." Thomas's voice shook. "There's too many of 'em." Josiah smiled grimly. "There's always too many of 'em. That's why we fight." He looked to Clara, who met his gaze with that same fierce calm. "If we fall," she said, "let it be loud enough that the world hears." They formed a circle, 6 souls surrounded by smoke and sin, and waited. The first soldiers appeared through the mist like ghosts in gray. Their torches cast halos of firelight across their faces. There were at least 20 of them, maybe more, led by a tall captain with a red scar cutting down his cheek. He raised his pistol and called out, "Josiah Turner, lay down your weapon. The war is over." Josiah laughed, the sound raw and hollow. "Ain't no war here, only justice." The captain's smile faded. "You think you're a hero, boy? You're just a thief with a white woman and a death wish." Josiah stepped forward. "Then come and collect your debt." The captain lowered his arm. "Fire!" The swamp exploded with gunfire. Josiah dropped to one knee, firing into the smoke. Thomas fired beside him, the recoil nearly knocking him down. Clara knelt behind a fallen log, reloading Josiah's musket with trembling hands. Each shot was a heartbeat, 1 second closer to death, 1 second closer to freedom. Mercy began to sing, a low, broken hymn rising through the chaos. "Lord, if I can't have heaven, give me peace down here." Her voice carried over the gunfire, over the screams, over the crackling of fire eating the trees. The Confederates charged, boots sinking into the mud, bayonets gleaming. Josiah met them head-on, his knife flashing like lightning. He moved with fury and grace, a man who had spent his whole life kneeling and now refused to bow again. He slit one throat, then another. His musket butt shattered a soldier's jaw, blood mixed with rain, fire with tears. Thomas fell beside him, shot through the chest. Mercy caught a bullet as she tried to drag him back. She died with her hands clasped in prayer. Clara screamed, firing the musket until it clicked empty. The recoil tore her shoulder, but she didn't stop. When the smoke cleared for a heartbeat, only Josiah and Clara were left standing. The captain stepped forward, pistol raised. "It's over," he said. "You've lost." Josiah looked around, at the bodies of his people, at the burning trees, at the graveyard their dream had become. Then he smiled faintly. "No," he said. "We showed you what freedom looks like. That's more than you'll ever own." The captain sneered. "You'll hang for this." Josiah lifted his knife, eyes steady. "Then hang me as a free man." The captain fired. The shot struck Josiah in the chest. He fell back into Clara's arms, the world blurring into gray. She held him close, pressing her hand against the wound. "Don't you dare leave me," she whispered. He coughed, blood staining her dress. "You remember what I told you. Freedom don't die." His hand went still. Clara screamed, a sound that tore through the swamp and the sky and every heart that ever beat in bondage. The soldiers approached cautiously, wary of the fire and the woman who now knelt beside her fallen husband. Clara looked up at them, her eyes wild, hair loose and tangled. "You can burn it all," she said, her voice low and trembling, "but you can't kill what he started." The captain raised his gun, but for a moment he hesitated. Something in her gaze, the defiance, the grief, made his hand falter. He lowered the weapon. "Take her," he ordered coldly. "She's worth more alive." They dragged her away as the swamp burned behind her. She didn't scream, she didn't cry, she only whispered his name, over and over, until the sound faded into the crackle of dying fire. By dawn, the swamp was ash. The soldiers buried their dead and left, but those who lived swore they heard something strange before they rode away. A voice in the mist, deep and steady, singing an old hymn. "Ain't no chains can hold my soul." They said it was Josiah, that the swamp itself carried his spirit, guarding the land where the first free colony had stood. And in the years that followed, when the wind passed through the Georgia pines just right, the freedmen would look to the horizon and whisper, "That's Josiah's song, the song of the man who fought hell and won his heaven." The house on the hill was silent now. Once it had been a plantation, a monument to cruelty and pride. Now its white columns were streaked with soot, its porch sagging under the weight of years. Wild vines crept through the broken windows, swallowing the past inch by inch. The wind moaned through the cracks, carrying ghosts in its wake. And in one of the rooms, behind a heavy door barred from the inside, Clara Turner sat in a rocking chair, no longer the fragile mistress's daughter, no longer the forbidden lover, but the widow of the Revolution. Her hair, once golden, had turned to tangled silver. Her eyes, once full of warmth, now held the weight of 1,000 funerals. Yet she still wore around her neck the small iron pendant Josiah had forged from a slave shackle, a promise of freedom that no man could take. Every night she lit a single candle by the window, and every night she whispered into the dark, "I'm still here, Josiah. I'm still keeping your fire." After Josiah's death, Clara had been dragged north by soldiers, a prisoner of war and scandal. Whispers followed her everywhere. The white woman who married her father's slave, the mad widow who cursed every soldier that touched her. They kept her in a convent for a time, trying to make her forget, but faith could not bury what love had burned into her bones. On the 5th night, she broke a nun's jaw with a candle holder and vanished into the marshes. Rumor said she walked for days barefoot through the mud until she found the ruins of Cumberland Swamp, the place where her husband had fallen. There, in the ashes of the Revolt, she rebuilt a cabin from burnt timber and bone and swore she would never leave. Locals called her the Ghost Wife. Others called her cursed, but freedmen, the descendants of Josiah's followers, called her something else, Mother Turner. They came to her in secret, fugitives, orphans, the broken and the hunted. She gave them food, shelter, and stories. She told them of Josiah's stand, of his courage, his laughter, the way he'd hum old work songs while sharpening his knife. And as the years passed, his legend grew. In 1879, 12 years after the rebellion, the government sent soldiers again. They came to erase what they called the swamp cult, the gatherings of former slaves and their white leader's widow. They burned the cabins, they tore down the chapel, but when they reached Clara's house, something stopped them. A black storm rolled in from nowhere, lightning striking so close the earth itself trembled. The soldiers swore they saw a figure standing beside Clara in the doorway, tall, broad-shouldered, holding a musket that shimmered with ghostly light. They fled before dawn. After that night, no one tried to harm her again. But Clara was no saint. The years had sharpened her grief into vengeance. Every few months, someone disappeared. An ex-overseer, a bounty hunter, a man who once bragged about putting down the Turner uprising. They would be found days later, floating in the swamp, throats slit, or faces carved with the shape of a broken chain. The white townsfolk whispered that Josiah's ghost did it. The freedmen knew better. It was Clara. The woman who had once trembled in silk gowns now moved through the marsh like a shadow. She had learned to shoot, to track, to kill. Her victims always vanished near the old Turner estate, and though sheriffs came searching, they never found her. Some said the swamp itself protected her. Others said she had made a pact with the spirits of the dead rebels. Whatever the truth, she lived. And she made sure no one forgot why. In the fall of 1883, a traveling journalist from Charleston named Elias Ward found his way to her door. He had heard tales of the widow of the swamp and wanted the story, the truth behind the rebellion that had haunted Georgia for nearly 2 decades. When he entered, he found a frail woman wrapped in shawls, her hair long and silver, her voice soft as dust, but her eyes, those eyes, still burned with the same fire that had made Josiah fall in love with her. She poured him tea and listened to his questions in silence. Then, at last, she said, "You want the story? The truth ain't buried. It's right here." She rose, slowly, and pointed to the wall behind her. There hung Josiah's musket, cleaned, oiled, and shining despite the years below it. A wooden cross carved with a single word, "Freedom." Elias asked, "Do you regret it? Loving him? Losing everything for him?" She looked at him for a long time before answering, "You don't lose what was never yours to begin with. I wasn't my father's daughter. I wasn't any man's property. Josiah showed me that. He didn't just free himself, he freed me too." Her voice cracked. "And as long as someone remembers him, he ain't dead." Elias published the story under the title The Widow of the Revolution. It spread like wildfire, across the South, across the North, across the ocean. Some called her a liar, others called her a hero, the church called her a sinner, the poor called her a saint, but to the people whose blood ran with hers, the children of the swamp, the descendants of those who dared to dream, she was something greater. A keeper of truth, a living ghost of freedom. When Clara Turner finally died in the winter of 1887, no priest would bury her, no family claimed her, but when her cabin was found, the ground around it was covered in footprints, hundreds of them, former slaves, freedmen, children, women. All had come to say goodbye. They buried her beside Josiah beneath a live oak whose roots had grown around his grave. Someone carved words into the tree bark, "Two souls, one flame, forever free." And as dusk fell over the swamp, the wind carried the faint sound of singing, deep, mournful, and beautiful, "Ain't no master over me." The same song Josiah had sung before his final stand, the song that still echoes even now when the night is heavy and the air smells like rain. By the time the century turned and the Old South began to fade into photographs and ghost stories, the name Turner had become both curse and crown. It was whispered in cotton fields and schoolhouses, carried in hymns sung under breath, written in trembling ink on secret pages of family Bibles. But in the heart of Georgia, where the swamp still held its breath around the ruins of Fairmont Plantation, that name was spoken not with fear, but with reverence. For the Turner blood still ran there. The first child born to Josiah and Clara Turner came into the world on a stormy night in 1873, a year after the rebellion. They named him Samuel Josiah Turner, a boy born of 2 worlds that were never meant to touch. His mother raised him in hiding, teaching him to read by candlelight, teaching him to pray not to a God of chains but to one of justice. She told him of his father, not as a murderer but as a man who refused to die on his knees, She told him of the fire that burned through the cotton, of the songs that rose higher than the flames, and every year on the anniversary of the rebellion, she would take him to the edge of the swamp and whisper, "This is where freedom began." When Clara died, Samuel was 15. He buried her himself under the same oak that held his father's grave. From that day, he carried their story like a weapon, not one made of steel, but of truth. By the 1890s, Samuel had left Georgia for good. He moved north, passing through states still haunted by the Civil War's shadow. He found work in a steel mill in Pittsburgh, then later as a teacher in a small freedmen's school in Richmond. But wherever he went, trouble followed him, because his name carried rebellion. The white men in town whispered, "That's Josiah's boy, the slave who married the master's daughter." The black community whispered too, "That's Turner's blood. The fire still burns in him." And both were right. When he spoke like his father, calm, powerful, his words carrying the gravity of prophecy. He began writing pamphlets about justice and equality, about a future where a man's skin was not a sentence. His writings spread across the South, passed hand to hand in churches and taverns. Some called him dangerous, others called him divine. But the fire never left the Turner name. In 1902, Samuel returned to Georgia. He had heard that the state planned to rebuild Fairmont Plantation, to turn it into a museum celebrating Southern heritage. The land that had once drunk the blood of slaves would now be polished and sold as history. He couldn't let that happen. So one night, under a sky thick with storm clouds, Samuel rode back to the swamp, the same path his father once walked barefoot, the same wind carrying whispers of vengeance through the trees. He stood before the ruins of the mansion, now little more than charred brick and creeping moss, and there, under the same oak where his parents slept, he made a vow, "No one will profit from this pain." He poured kerosene on the ground and lit a match. For the second time in history, the Fairmont estate burned, but this time it wasn't rebellion, it was remembrance. When the fire was out and the ashes cooled, Samuel disappeared. Some said he fled to Harlem, where he became a preacher and built a church that fed the hungry and taught the children. Others swore they saw him years later in New Orleans, organizing workers, his voice echoing in the French Quarter like a sermon from the grave. No one knows where he died, but his words, his father's words, survived. In the early 1920s, a historian named Professor Albert Gaines discovered Clara's journal hidden in the ruins of the swamp cabin. Her handwriting was faded, her ink mixed with tears, but every line told the story the world had buried, the revolt, the love, the fire, and the truth. The journal became a manuscript, the manuscript became a banned book, and the banned book became a legend. The Turner Rebellion, a love written in fire. It was never sold in Southern stores, but it spread anyway, read in secret, quoted in sermons, hidden under floorboards like scripture. The Turner bloodline became myth, a symbol of what the South wanted to forget and what the oppressed refused to let die. By the 1940s, the name appeared again, not in whispers but in headlines. Clara May Turner, Josiah's great-granddaughter, was arrested in Birmingham for leading a protest against segregation. When asked in court if she had anything to say before sentencing, she lifted her chin and said, "I come from fire. You can't scare me with smoke." Reporters called her the daughter of rebellion, but she didn't flinch. She spent 6 months in prison, and when she came out, she led thousands through the streets with the same fearless eyes her ancestors had worn when they faced the whip. The Turner legacy did not die in blood. It lived in courage. It lived in every sermon that dared to speak of freedom, in every child who asked why, in every song sung beneath a sky still heavy with history. The South never forgot the Turners. It tried to erase them, to twist them into cautionary tales, but the land, the swamp, and the people remembered. To the world, Josiah was a murderer. To his kin, he was Moses with a musket. To Clara, he was love. To time, he became legend. And now, over a century later, when the wind moves through the cane fields at night, locals still swear they see a flicker of light in the swamp, the faint glow of a lantern moving slowly among the trees. They say if you follow it, you'll find 2 graves marked by an oak. One for the man who burned the old world, one for the woman who stood beside him. And if you listen close beneath the hum of crickets and the sigh of the wind, You can still hear their voices, tangled in song, defiant and tender. We are free. We are forever free. That was Josiah's final legacy. Not rebellion, not violence, not vengeance, but freedom born from forbidden love, a fire that began in the fields of Georgia and burned its way through generations until even the sky could not forget his name, the Turner bloodline, a legacy carved in flame, a love that refused to die.